Hey everyone, what is going on? It is Brian. We are back, and I have a video that's a little bit different than my reviews that I've done or the first impressions. And hopefully this is the first in a series. So I've done some videos where I've done some blinds, but this is one where I want to specifically kind of walk through a tasting and essentially talk with you all about how I approach tasting, or more specifically, how you might approach tasting. So there's a number of ways that people can taste things, and a lot of folks that I run into, they're either like it or don't like it kind of people. There's some people who just can't quite figure out flavor notes unless somebody were to tell them something. And honestly, you can drink any way that you want. I just like flavor and I like taste. I've done this with coffee. I've done this with chocolate. Here I am with whiskey. And really what happens with me is I sort of just via mental notes or if I write it down, I kind of do a progression through a sip of something, or in terms of coffee or like a bite of something when it comes to chocolate. So I go progression from like some of the first notes I notice towards the end. And a lot of people talking about whiskey do the same. They'll talk about what's on the front of the palate, the mid palate, and then how something finishes. The thing that's interesting about whiskey in general, as we talk about it, comparing products is comparing different distilleries, different yeasts, different mash bills, different proofs, and a different amount of single barrels. Even batches from batch to batch of a steady product can vary. And so one thing that I find unique is finding a product that you can keep as kind of a control and then being able to isolate some things from that. So today we are taking a look at 5 different single barrel Buffalo Trace bottles. So we know that this is mash bill number 1 from the Buffalo Trace Distillery and their 90 proof release of that. So all of these bottles are unique single barrel expressions. And what I find interesting about doing that is we're able to take a product that should have a relatively stable profile, and we're comparing bottle to bottle to bottle to bottle to bottle and see how ones differ or are similar to one another. And what my hope is in tasting through these and describing to you all, and or possibly having a linked tasting wheel either below or above, that you all will be able to understand a little bit of how to differentiate things, whether you're doing a flight of Buffalo Trace or you're putting a Buffalo Trace up against a Blanton's, against an Eagle Rare. Maybe you have a flight of Four Roses, or maybe you're trying the Old Forester 150th batches 1, 2, and 3. That you'll be able to kind of compare and contrast some of these flavors. Now, when it comes to coffee, we do this in a thing called cupping, and this allows us to put coffees on a table. And when you go from one to another, you're able to see how things jump out or stand out in one, maybe more so than it does in another, or how one might be similar to another. If you have a pour isolated, it might be hard to differentiate from something else that you're not immediately having before or after, what its acidity would be like, or how fruity it is, or what the mouth feels like. So as we taste through a flight like this, we're able to quickly see in a snapshot how they differ from pour to pour. So we are going to taste through a single barrel called Thing 2. We are going to move to a pick called State Liquors. This is actually a Buffalo Trace I was able to pick. Merle's Whiskey Kitchen, one from our local Louisville Bourbon Club group, Busty Buffalo, and then finishing off with one of my favorites that I've had from Westport Whiskey and Wine. Why don't you go ahead and hit subscribe down below. Give me a thumbs up. Let me know if you're enjoying this content. I try and put this out weekly for you all so we can engage with one another, but then also to see if there's things that you all are interested in hearing me talk about. If it's something I'm not doing on the channel, feel free to shoot me a line. I'd love to hear some ideas of what you all would like to see me talk about upcoming on the channel. Now, I'm going to quickly go through and nose these glasses. Now, I will say the main focus of this might be more on the palate, but the similar thing is going to happen in the nose. I feel like I've done this enough, so nosing is something I'm able to kind of quickly compare some of the differences to, but I want to go quickly through that because the main thing I want to talk about is on the palate. So as we pick up this first glass is kind of classically Buffalo Trace. You get notes of cherry, you get notes of oak, and you get notes of honey, and a little bit grainy. I feel like a lot of the times Buffalo Trace is a little bit younger, and so you get a little bit more of that grainy youthfulness in it than some of the other products. And I will say those are kind of flavor profiles I notice across the board when it comes to all Buffalo Trace products. It seems to have cherry or red fruit. It seems to have a little bit of honey and then varying amounts of oak. Let's go to the second glass here. Now, interestingly enough, and I will say different flavor wheels are going to talk about things differently. It seems like every spectrum of flavor that I dive into, they have their own unique flavor wheels, and they have their own reasoning as to why some flavors are attributed, or some tastes or smells are attributed to some things. You know, this might be influenced by the barrel, influenced by the yeast and stuff like that. Now, what's tricky about that sometimes is if you just have a familiarity with tasting things, flavors that you've grown up with, grandma's apple pie, fresh Rainier cherries, orange slices, any of those things, they're going to shape the way that you taste. There's no right or wrong way that anyone tastes, and there are no right and wrong flavors, because all this is in the end is whiskey. It's not cherries and apples and caramel. Those aren't in the glass. Now, what I like to talk about, especially when it comes to coffee, we're all going to talk about flavors slightly different. What I call peach, you might say apricot, or vice versa. But the point isn't exactly to hit the right notes. The point is really to figure out what I would call something and what you might call something, and how we can commonly understand what the other person is tasting by doing some sort of correction of interpretation of flavors. Basically, understanding each other's language and how we interpret flavors. So back again, we're on the second one. Now, I will say, compared to the cherry and the honey that I mentioned on the first one, so we have fruit and we have a little bit of honey, the second glass has more caramelized sugar notes. We're getting into caramel and we're getting into vanilla. So while there's some fruitiness there and some graininess there, it is more in the caramels and vanilla sugars sweetness than it is on the fruity and the honey and oaky sweetness. Let's move into the third glass. Now this one is interesting because the second glass had caramel as a note, or as I would define it as caramel. This one has caramel, but it's slightly more, as I would say, salted caramel. There's something about it that is a little bit more salted, like a salted pretzel or something like that. There's something that's a little bit more salty, but still has a similar caramel sweetness. It has a touch more spice to it and red fruit. The fourth sample, a little bit back again to classic Buffalo Trace. Red fruit, honey, and some vanilla sweetness. And I would say the last glass is probably the most unique. It has kind of a dusty red fruit, so it reminds me of red and purple fruits, if you will. And when I mean that, I mean, again, if you were to look at a flavor wheel, you would see fruits that fall into these categories. We're talking about cherry and raspberry, or we might be talking about grapes and blueberries. They kind of fall into different hues of flavors. This has this, but it is a little bit funkier. It has a little bit of leather to it. It has some oak and it has some vanilla. Now let's go down and taste and see if we can't pull apart some differences in these glasses. So going back to the first sample, the palate starts kind of bigger and with some more spice initially. I think you all might be familiar with spice, whether it be something that has a high rye content, which you know this doesn't, or maybe it's just young, and so it's got some of that younger, youthful spice to it, or it could be really high proof, which we know this one also isn't. But all those sorts of things can contribute to something coming off a little bit hotter or having a little bit more spice, let alone just the fact that it might have flavor profile of some baking spice or some cinnamon or some nutmeg. So this one definitely hits with a little bit more spice initially. And then again, like the nose, we move into some of the typical red fruit, cherry flavored to be specific, and some oak that sits on the palate. As it lingers, it's what I would call a touch medicinal. So it has this kind of licorice type note, but then lingers with a creamy vanilla. Let's go ahead and move into sample 2. Now, immediately what I notice on the palate is it doesn't have the front of the mouth spice. Instead, the spice kind of comes in towards the middle. So what you notice initially to the sip would be some of these red fruits. Once the spice kind of comes in the middle palate back here, it continues on with more brown sugar, more caramel and vanilla. So not unlike what we mentioned also like on the nose. So comparatively, we have one that was a little bit more fruity, and we have this one, which actually sits a little bit heavier on the palate too. This is something that I like to look for. You've probably heard me make comments on the Intro Proof podcast or in other videos. These are all 90 proof, so they're going to be a little bit lower, but something that makes a pick like this stand out to me, or an Elijah Craig pick stand out to me, is when I find something that has a proof and it should follow a similar baseline, relatively light. You find a profile that has more saturated flavors. It has more perceived weightiness on the palate. And it's something that runs into a profile like that seems to stand out to me more, because it feels like it's a richer, more decadent, or more filling pour. So 2 gives off not a ton more body, but it does seem to have a bit more weight than A. Let's keep moving to the third sample. It has less spice than the first 2, and I think because of that, it allows the oak and the honey and the caramel notes kind of soak in as if you have some sort of like spoon bread or something like that has all this saturated butter towards the bottom, or like some sort of cake where all of the oil or the butter or whatever is sitting on the bottom. So as you kind of take a bite, all of the richest flavors sit underneath. And so when you get a full bite of it, you get all that weightiness, kind of saturated flavor that comes out as you chew on it that you didn't exactly notice just from taking a bite of the top layer. The palate comes off a little softer and a little silkier than the first 2, but not at the sacrifice of seeming like it has a little bit more richness presented to it. So while the flavors aren't all that unlike the other 2, the first being red fruit, the second being caramelized sugars, this one does have some vanilla and caramel as well, but it has some oak and a lot of saturation of flavors to the palate. Let's move to the fourth sample. Now, I like the flavors that come on this fourth sample, but comparatively to the other 3, it does seem a bit thinner in body. So this is one where the mouthfeel just doesn't seem to carry the weight or heaviness or thickness of flavors that the other ones do. It's got a nice, slightly tingling spice. It's not overly spicy, but it does kind of prickle and tingle on the sides of the tongue. It's got some good red fruit, and it's got a little vanilla. So pretty characteristic Buffalo Trace, easy to drink, but about drinks its proof of what I'd expect, 90 proof. Let's go ahead and go to the last sample. Now this fifth sample seems to give the third sample a run for its money. Like I mentioned on the nose, it has these funky, almost dusty whiskey sort of flavor profiles, with these kind of leather and oak notes being more prominent in it, but not at the sacrifice of red and purple fruits on the palate. And what's interesting about that, I feel like it also has a little bit more graininess than the other one. So this one almost tastes like a cereal, like a kick cereal or a trick cereal, or some sort of cereal that has like artificially raspberry cherry-y flavored fruits, but also comes off slightly grainy, slightly corny in its texture. It's not a bad thing necessarily, and as the bottle's been opened, it's definitely dissipated. But this is one where you have kind of some musty, really easy, well mixed caramel flavors, vanilla flavors, oak, and red fruits. I know this might be difficult without you being able to try these exact pours, but what I hope it does is it encourages you to either find some friends, or maybe you have some single barrels of a similar selection that you have yourself, or maybe you just have some other pours that you want to try. And I don't mean in a blind where you really try and dissect and try and figure out which one has maybe the best flavor. I'm not even really looking at the best flavor here. I'm really just trying to see where they're different. We have one that's fruity, one that has a lot of caramelized sugars, one that has a little bit more oak and has a really thick palate. We have one that has really good flavors, but it's a little bit of a soft palate. And then we have the last one, which seems to have everything really stewed and mixed and balanced together in a really pleasing and unique way. That's kind of unlike the others. Not really a reason to rank these here, More so just wanting to taste through and see if you all can get behind the way that I kind of process through how things taste. And again, either reference, whether it's over here, or whether it's a link down below, maybe a tasting wheel. One of the things that really helped me as I was getting started in coffee and when I get started in chocolate was just to take a flavor wheel and take sips of things and try and identify what I was tasting and visualizing where that is on a tasting wheel. Another good practice would be to actually get yourself some citrus fruits, get yourself some different berries, get yourself some honey or some caramel or some vanilla, some brown sugar, some toasted sugars, and really try and taste these things and figure out some of the nuances of what they taste like and how they differ from one another. That's the thing that I can't exactly teach you all in this particular form, but hopefully as you're pulling things apart, or as I'm pulling things apart, it might be helpful in showing you all how I would identify how things are different in profile. If you do happen to have some of these pours, feel free to grab a glass, pour it out, and let me know if you share any similarities to these profiles. If you all have some Buffalo Traces, I'd love to hear about some of the picks for you all and the notes that you're able to pull out if they're similar to any of these here. Tonight, I am doing all of my tasting in our entry-proof podcast, Keep It Neat tasting glasses. I will have a link down below where you can get these from as they are available. However, you can also subscribe to us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/entryproofpodcast, and you'll get some of these through one of the perk reward levels as well. As if you want more content, join us on the Entry Proof Podcast. That's a podcast I do with Drew P. Whiskey, and he's also here on YouTube. We're usually on his channel on Thursday nights doing all types of stuff, whether it be an interview or just dissecting recent barrel picks or any miscellaneous topics that we have. If you don't want to throw anything on the Patreon, you don't have time for the Entry Proof Podcast, hey, no big deal. Totally get that. I'm glad that you tuned into this video, and I would love another way if you wanted to share and help support the show. It would be to share the show in your local groups. I'd be taking any of the videos, be it this one or any of the other ones that you think that some of the folks in your group might find helpful. Drop them a link to the video. Maybe they'll be able to find some information that's also helpful to them as well. Let me know if there's other flights that you want to hear me talk about. I know that I had people specifically talk about Four Roses, but I figured before I got into Four Roses, that might be a little deep or a little tricky to get into because of the varying profiles and age. I wanted to do something that had a nice stable baseline, and we talk about dissecting flavor a little bit together. Until next time, everybody, we'll see you later.